Inside and out, it's Hugh Newman.
Thank you.
And Hugh will be talking about the giants of Stonehenge, Glastonbury, and ancient Britain. So thank you very much, Hugh.
Thank you, Tor. Hello. Can you hear me okay? Is the mic working okay? Good. So hello, everybody. I'm sure you've had an amazing weekend, full of legends, including Tor, of course, who's obviously the ultimate legend. That's why you called it this conference name, isn't it? Yeah, I'm going to be talking about something that's quite weird. You probably had a bit of that already, looking at the lineup of speakers over the last couple of days. But I'm going to be getting into the story of the giants. Now, even very close to here, literally within a few yards of here, we actually have one of the most famous giant accounts we actually feature in our book. It even ended up in our top 10 of giants of Britain, because just in the Abbey, about 900 or just under 900 years ago, something remarkable was discovered, and yet it's not really publicized, it's not talked about. That's one of the accounts, which is extremely local to here, that I'm going to talk about today. This is the latest book, The Giants of Stonehenge and Ancient Britain, which I wrote with my good friend Jim Vieira. Here's a few other ones I've written or co-written, including Sense in the Earth, which was something that Peter Knight and Sue Wallace put together. A few wooden books published by John Martineau. I'm sure many of you know him. But our first book on the giants was about North America. This was called Giants on Record, America's Hidden History Sequence in the Mounds and the Smithsonian Files. This came out way back, actually, now in 2015, and we actually did our book launch here in October 2015. That's my buddy Jim Vieira. You can see how serious we are about our research in this photo. Yeah, you do have to keep your tongue in your cheek a little bit when you're talking about giants. But in North America, we came across over 1,000 accounts of 7-foot, 18-foot skeletons in the historical and archaeological record, including in academic journals, Smithsonian journals that were being published in the late 1800s, and many others. Many universities even had them on display. And these were Native American giants found in the mounds, because there's over 100,000 mounds of earthworks recorded in the middle part of America. Here's some of the accounts. I mean, it got so extreme with our research, we actually had an office in Massachusetts, where Jim's from, with all the accounts lined up on the walls like a sort of crazy man. And we actually also had a History Channel TV show for 6 episodes, and then they cancelled it because we were criticising the Smithsonian and all these academics a bit too much. Here's a handful of the accounts. I mean, actually, since then, in North America, we've got now 1,500 accounts at least, and many of these are recorded in literally every state in America, going into Mexico, Canada, Hawaii, all the way up to Martha's Vineyard off the coast of New England, so on and so forth. And this is like genuine newspaper accounts, thousands of them, genuine academic journals, genuine archaeologists finding these remarkably tall skeletons. And what you get in North America, you actually find many of the skeletons have double rows of teeth, something we occasionally find in Britain as well, but not as much. There, it was normal. It was like these tribal giants, these rulers, these sort of priestly elite almost, often had these double rows of teeth, which was one of the genetic traits of the giants in that part of the world. We even have a number of horned skulls. We have a number of other anatomic anomalies, like some skulls which were 40-inch circumference, which is like twice the size of my head. Some of the skulls were so big, you could wear them like a kind of helmet on top of your head. This is what we're talking about here. There was something as well called the Adena jaw. The Adena were this 4,000-year-old tribe who had these robust characteristics, who became known as the real giants of the Americas. Here's our top 10 of North America, and very famous sites like Serpent Mound in Ohio. We have Catalina Island off the coast of California, where there were hundreds of giants were found there. And you can see some of these go up to 18 feet tall. But Britain, even taller. So we've got one up on America, as well as football. So this is where we got into this research. We started after this came out and we got kind of deleted from the History Channel. We started to put a worldwide book of giants together. We've got tens of thousands of accounts all over the world, which is completely written out of the history books. But we started writing the chapter on Britain, beginning in the West Country, and it grew so immensely. We ended up finding 250 accounts in Great Britain and Ireland alone. And even the Queen, she was into giants, as you can see in that photo there. That's actually the skeleton of Charles Byrne, the Irish giant, which has been on display until relatively recently. It shows you how widespread in Britain and Ireland giants are. There's not all of them here. If we put all of them on it, it'd just be a map of skulls. So we just put areas on, really. And some of the accounts here, you can actually see up on the top right, much like we find in America. Newspapers, academic journals, history books, town and county histories, everything else you can think of, including oral traditions and druidic traditions as well, which we'll get into. And again, yeah, there's the Queen. I believe she was a giantologist. That's my theory, because we know that Prince Philip, he was into UFOs. You know, he had a secret library of UFOs. So our theory is that the Queen's got a secret collection of giant books. These are just some of the accounts, as I said, from Britain. I mean, you'd be surprised. You know, you travel around Britain, you go and look at ancient megalithic sites, you will start seeing giant, if you know all the places and exact locations they were dug up from, you would be surprised. You've probably driven past it. You've probably stopped at picnics at some of these places. It's quite remarkable. But they're more often than not, linked to megalithic sites or ancient sites, earthworks and other such things. And we'll see that even at Stonehenge as a good story associated with giants. But they go all across Europe into the rest, basically everywhere around the planet. That's a future book. We're not going to get into different countries today. Here's our top 10 of Britain. And you can see there's me on the bottom left there, just over 6 foot. And then we see it goes up. We've got a 21 foot. Well, we've got bones of a 21 footer from Northumberland, a place called Corbridge. Some of you might know that area. We've got famous ones from Stonehenge, 14 foot 10 inches, which we're going to talk about shortly. We've got Repton Giant, which was actually featured on a BBC documentary, which I'll show you a small clip of, which we might have to edit out of the video. Lundy Island, even Cadi Idris, which is one of my favourite places in Wales, and Maze Howe in Orkney, where a 10-foot skeleton was actually found, but no one's talking about it. No one's discussing that. It's not mentioned at all when you go up to Orkney. But even if you go to the founding stories of ancient Britain, you'll find that the further you go back into these traditional stories of where Britain, well, these founding stories of Britain are fascinating because they all have giants in them. It's quite remarkable. He's at the Smithsonian. And so, you know, we have the story of Albion, who became the protector of the land, all the stories of William Blake, so forth. We have the story of Albina, who was one of 33 sisters who was banished from Greece by her father, for being murderers. They basically murdered their 33 would-be husbands that her father was trying to get. And they were banished from the country, set out on a boat, and they ended up in Britain, or what was known then as, actually called Merdin's Precinct, the oldest name for Britain, which is Merlin's Precinct. But even before that, we have stories of giants inhabiting the land. I mean, when Albina came over, apparently there was no one in the British Isles at the time. They were so bored, these 33 women, that they ended up mating with these semi-divine demonic beings called the incubi. And what they gave birth to were a race of giants. And these were ferocious, cannibalistic giants. These are all in the traditional histories of early Britain. You can look into this. There's many different references we've got in our own book where you can find this information. And I find this really interesting. Is you've got certain numbers being talked about as well, like 33 and so forth. And also, after they kind of bred and they started getting basically breeding with the giants they were giving birth to. It became this kind of incestuous race of these. They became more ferocious, taller giants, more cannibalistic, and they spread around the country and ended up in Cornwall, where the final group who remained after they were battling between themselves for thousands of years. Uh, the leader of that group was called Gog Magog, and he was then it got to a point where Brutus the Trojan in all the early stories turned up in Britain and was had to battle with the giants, the remaining giants. This is actually Merlin, picture of Merlin here, and picture of Merlin and a giant at Stonehenge, which we'll come on to shortly. But the interesting thing about Merlin is that he was said, if you look into some of the early traditions of where he really came from, he was actually, his mother was like a witch or a sorceress, and his father was one of these incubi who was like linked with albina, if you look into the old records. So I find that really intriguing, that there's this sort of shamanic sorcerer connection with him and these early giants. You know the story of Brutus. He battled with Gog Magog. He threw him off the cliffs. Um, but then in other stories, he survived, and as you can see on the right here, he was taken to London, and even today, they're still in the Guildhall, but they become Gog and Magog, not just Gog Magog, as such. And so there's different versions of these stories, and we put them all in the book. I'm not going to go into everything now because it gets a bit much. But they've become like the protectors of Britain. They've become like the protectors of the mysteries. And the Guildhall is renowned for keeping old maps, old records, old texts that have survived for hundreds and thousands of years in some cases. They are paraded around London still in the Lord Mayor's show every November. As the protectors of ancient Britain, and if Gog Magog were ever to be destroyed or fall, Britain would be in trouble. Now, they have been blown up, they have been set on fire, they have been bombed over the years. They've been rebuilt and replaced in the Guildhall over these different times. Again, we have in the same books we're looking at here. A lot of this information comes from an early book by a monk from Bangor called Nennius, from like a Welsh from the 9th and 10th century. Most of it comes from the History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. And this actual image here is the earliest known image of Stonehenge, which we're going to get onto next, because Merlin was involved in Stonehenge according to this particular text. And this was from a kind of French version of the History of the Kings of Britain by Robert Wace. And it clearly shows a giant lifting the lintel into place with Merlin and King Ambrosius. Now, the interesting thing about Merlin is actually this gentleman over here. This is a beautiful picture by Yuri Leach, who I know is at this conference. And this is an early kind of depiction of, he's from his youth. Some of the stories indicate that it was a time when he was young, where he was involved in many of the stories that have been written about. And like I said, Merlin's Precinct was one of the earliest names of ancient Britain. In the story, you have all these creation stories of giants found in Britain, coming to Britain, battling with giants, all this kind of stuff. But in the same text, in a different part of it, you have the story of Stonehenge being constructed and all the stones being brought by giants from the furthest reaches of Africa and being put up and created and built in a place called Killaroos in Ireland. Now, there's a big debate about where this is. We go into lots of ideas in the book. But then eventually, thousands of years later, King Ambrosius, who was, in the Wessex area, this kind of area, it was a huge battle. Many of his men were defeated. So he set Uther Pendragon to go to Ireland to collect the stones on what was called the Giants' Dance. Again, we have giants at the core of this. Bring them over to Salisbury Plain and erect this monument in honour of the slain warriors that died in this battle. And Uther Pendragon went over there with 15,000 warriors. They couldn't budge one stone, couldn't move a stone, but they could when Merlin arrived, and they sent him over to use his magic to kind of move the stones. In different traditions, different versions of the text, they say he either used magic and sleight. In other stories, he used engines, gears, and levers, like he had some kind of ancient technology to move these stones and place them, and he brought them on his own somehow all the way from Ireland to Salisbury Plain. Now we know that the blue stones come from West Wales, yeah, the whole Preseli area, and that part of West Wales is something that Robin Heath was telling me about a while back. That part of Ireland was, for long thousands of years, it was inhabited by the Irish, and you could easily get across the Irish Channel, and so that was actually part of Ireland. So it fits in with the story of the Bluestones coming from Wales, although they talk about it being in Ireland. And the other thing is that why would they choose this story that these giants from Africa, potentially North Africa, bringing these stones over? Well, if you actually go to North Africa and you go to Libya and Tunisia, you actually see these. These are found all over the place, and these look almost identical to what we see at Stonehenge. And these are probably prehistoric. In some accounts, they're Roman versions, they're Roman grape presses somehow, um, big grapes. And you have the mortise and tenon joints as well up here, which kind of show you same kind of styling as we get at Stonehenge itself. Here was some of the construction, but look at this. This just looks like it could be a photo of Stonehenge. This is actually near Tripoli in Libya. Most of these are. There's even some found in Tunisia as well, just over the border, where you have these trilithon type structures. And there's even stories in this part of Tunisia from a place called Duga, where they have Romans who were there, going back a few hundred years BC, who actually had giants as slaves, and you can actually see that in this picture here. So we have even actual giants, actual trilithons, linked with this area that traditionally these stones were said to have originally come from in legend. This is obviously Stonehenge. There's me flying my drone from my garden, because I live just down the road from here. There's a bunch of my buddies there, and this is what's left of Stonehenge. Now, this isn't all that's at Stonehenge, as you probably know. It's a much grander landscape when you start looking around, and there's some extremely ancient parts of it as well. These include these giant pine posts that once existed there. For a long while, they were blobs of paint in the car park. Now they're just these small kind of wooden kind of domes placed in the grass next to Stonehenge. But these would have been extremely tall, probably 20 to 30 feet tall. But the thing is, these were dated, and these were placed here next to Stonehenge 10,000 years ago, more or less, within 50 years either side of that. What were they doing 10,000 years ago? That's something we'll come on to a little bit later, because I believe there's a connection to some other very important sites from a different part of the world, which is going to be hitting the news big time this year. We have other stories as well of giants linked with Stonehenge. This is an old image from the 1600s, and you look at a book, there's a particular book, you've probably not heard of this, but it's called Fool's Bolt Soon Shot at Stonehenge by Reverend Robert Gay. He lived in Nettlecombe, Somerset, and it was written and published privately in 1666, not published properly until the early 1700s. And he wrote a book, and in this book, he says there was a tribe of giants from Somerset, Glastonbury included here, mainly from the Mendip Hills, who were called the Kanji or the Kangi, or the Kangik or Kanjik giants. And these were around for many thousands of years, going back to at least the Bronze Age, possibly older. And this is interesting. This image here is of the so-called giants with their clubs and long hair, which they were said to have had. And this Reverend Robert Gay was a bit of a legend, funnily enough. And he was involved, as well as being a reverend, he was involved in an uprising against the courts, where we had a local mob set fire to the government buildings. And he was imprisoned during the Civil War for his anarchist activities in 1643. So, respect to Reverend Robert Gay. Also for writing this book, because he wrote about this lost tradition of this actual tribe who, if you look through the old records, you find evidence of a tribe of kind of called the Kangi or something similar to that name in place names in the area as well. And the Kangi itself, the Can, people think is linked to the Canaanites of the Bible, which we'll come on to shortly. Now, in his book, he wrote about these two types of Kanji or Kangic giants. Some were kind of semi-divine beings. These were the earliest forms of the giants. This very much, is linked with when we start talking about the Anunnaki of ancient Bible lands, southeast Turkey, and the Watchers, and so forth. Actually, there was another group of giants who were more warrior-like, more like the actual Canaanites that their name seems to be connected with. The giants of antiquity, the semi-divine giants, are very similar to the incubi we spoke about earlier as well. And the thing about these is that they had a technique for working with stone because, according to Robert Gay, they actually created and built Stonehenge themselves. But they built it. They came over from Somerset to the corner of Wiltshire where Stonehenge is, on Salisbury Plain. Had a great battle with this incoming invaders who they thought were the Belgic people, and took them down basically, won their battle and created Stonehenge in honour of their kind of win, if you like. So this is the whole story of another story of why Stonehenge was built. But this is much more of an obscure book. It only got rediscovered in the last 20 years, this Fool's Bolt Soon Shot Stonehenge. So it hasn't hasn't got the popularity of the story of Merlin and Uther Pendragon and so forth. But the interesting thing about these as well, this is being a megalithomaniac, I'm obsessed by how they work this stone. One of the stories, this is very much like the Cyclops of ancient Greece, is that they had these kind of underground areas where they would work the stone and they would turn the stone to powder, reform it using superheating and different techniques, then shaping the stones back into megaliths you see today. They apparently did this at Stonehenge. Now, one of the weird things about Stonehenge, you all will probably know, this has been in there many times, you go inside Stonehenge and you see what looks like scoop marks, as though the stone has been softened. It's been scooped to finish it, but these haven't quite been finished. You see these here. This is very obvious. These are actually photos, really good photos by Simon Banton, who lent me these because he got better ones than I did. And then you've got the stone that's also lying down that has big striations, scoop marks. And these scoop marks are really intriguing. We find that this is that stone again. We even have what looks like a shape here, like a kind of arrow, it could be a shepherd's crook, that we find in Portugal, Karnak, Brittany, and so forth, which is a very ancient symbol, often carved in stone, going back to 6000 BC in some cases. But to have that here is really intriguing. Here we even have like a nub that you find in Peru sticking out the side here next to my head. There's lots of weird little features inside Stonehenge, which you might not notice unless you go right inside it at a certain time of day and year and catch the light on it. Now, this is very specific because there's a lot of sites like this around the world. We have these at Stonehenge. You can see this huge one here that's a fallen monolith, one of the trilithons. This is Machu Picchu in Peru. This is Aswan Quarry in Egypt. But this is granite. So is this, two different types of granite. This is sarsen, like a kind of hard sandstone. So what were they doing? What is all this? How do they do this? They make it look like they've softened it and turned it into butter. And so these stories intrigue me because there's also a gentleman called Joseph Davidovits who set up something called the Geopolymer Institute. And he believes that many megalithic sites are created like this. They're created by somehow turning the stone to powder, probably through some kind of sonic technology, and then reforming it, shaping it inside these kind of boxes and things like this, and then sort of smoothing it off. So this is a modern thing. This has been going on for about 15, 20 years, this Joseph Davidovits research. He believes the pyramids were built like this. This is a genuine scientist trying to put this theory forward. So suddenly all these kind of stories from the mid-1600s may have some reality to them. They may have had this technology. It might be one of the clues as to how they built these sites in the first place. Even Stanton Drew, our favourite Somerset stone circle, or triple stone circle. This is a remarkable site in its own right. Again, there's links with giants to this site, lots of legends, giants getting turned to stone and so forth. Also, we have the story, according to Robert Gay, this was, again, because these are conglomerate stones. If you go to Stanton Drew, you'll see that they're almost like gravel, sort of cemented together. It's kind of what it looks like. No one's quite worked out exactly what's going on here. But According to this book from 1666, Stanton Drew was created in the same way, and the Cangic Giants, this was their kind of one of their main strongholds. So no one's really heard of these Cangic Giants. It's one of these things that I find that something, just this random old book we discovered, which was influential at the time. In fact, Robert Gay actually influenced people like John Aubrey and William Stukeley, who became the famous antiquarians, who did all the beautiful illustrations and plans of Stonehenge and Avebury. And so, yeah, so I find this very, very intriguing. If we stay in Somerset, there's lots of stories, lots of legends of giants here. There's also lots of bones and teeth and skulls and skeletons have been found in this area. This is the image my brother put together a couple of years ago, a sketch, which I thought was quite funny. I wonder how they built these things. I wonder who built these things. But if you look into the founding stories of Glastonbury, we have Gwyn ap Nudd. There's something I know Yuri and Danu as well, who's going to be speaking here, written about. Gwyn ap Nudd is like the king of the fairies, resides in Glastonbury Tor, but he's also in other traditions. He's a giant who is one of the three holy astronomers of Britain. The other one being the giant Idris of Wales, and another one in a different part of Britain. We also have a Batcombe Hill, a Batcombe at Burn Hill, Somerset. It was a story of a giant blacksmith who was said to be appeased if you call out his name while standing on the hill. Exmoor, up on towards the coast, and Grabbist Hill Fort. You have giants embedded in the mythological landscape there, of them throwing stones around in like geomantic fashion, and a giant chair made of stone which one of the giants would sit in. In fact, they were so large that when he would wave at the villagers, it would cause a breeze and a wind to go through the town. That's how powerful this particular giant was. We have other stories here. I'm not going to read every possible thing out here, but these are all the accounts we've got in the Somerset part of our Wessex chapter in the book, because I thought it'd be interesting just to kind of put it in context and location at this particular conference. But I think just over towards the Dorset border, we have Sturton Cornwall, which is the southernmost stronghold of the giants, and there was a giant thigh bone over a yard long was said to have been found, and it was on display for some time, and even the discoverer believed this was linked with the Cangic Giants. The Cangic Giants were written about at this time. We have in the history of Somersetshire by Collinson, in Norton St Phillips, we have jawbone and teeth of a prodigious size were found. We have other accounts of tooth 3 inches and a quarter round. And after the root was broken off, it weighed 3 ounces and a half. So if that's a Cangic Giant's tooth, you don't want to be meeting them in a dark alley, because that is pretty impressive. And the stories go on. We find them all across, but you have to dig into the old records. You're not going to get this in basic local history books. You're not going to get this in your kind of school curriculum in Somerset or anything like this. You have to dig into the old records and you start finding them. Yeah, this is quite an interesting one from Wellsbury Camp Hill Fort, when they found one of the giants was absolutely massive, and the other, and he kind of had this uncivilized appearance, which means he probably had a large brow ridge and a receding head and a large jaw. And this was like they were living side by side with normal-sized humans at the time. Now, there's another interesting 9-footer that was found near Weston-super-Mare that we believe is linked with this. We have another one here, Loxton Churchyard. They found a skeleton cut off at the head, decapitated. Up to there, it was 6'3". With that on top of it, it would have been up nearly 8 feet tall. This is the one. I actually met the guy who witnessed this. I was taken to see. This is the area here, Nightstone Island. Have you been up to Weston-super-Mare? I guess it's the local beach here, isn't it? Really. This is what is an old picture of Nightstone Island. When they were first building this, a couple of 100 years ago, they were kind of turning this into some kind of spa kind of place. But when they did this, they found this 9-foot skeleton deep down in the earth in this particular spot. And this is the account. I met someone. I was taken to this guy who lives out there. He witnessed this when it happened when he was a kid. He actually saw, because the skeleton stayed on display for a very long time. Didn't have any photos, unfortunately, but I got a little interview with him. And then I found this account, so it kind of verified what he was saying. So even just around here, just in the surrounding counties and areas, we have 9-foot skeletons being discovered. We have legends of the three giants of Brent Knoll as well, for instance. It's one of the kind of famous hill forts of this area. There's different kind of more Arthurian traditions linked with this as well. But it's said to have been created by a giant or the devil who dropped a shovelful of earth when he was digging Cheddar Gorge. And in Arthurian legend, it was called the Mound of Frogs or the Mount of Frogs. And three giants at the time resided there. So you have these mythological stories embedded in these ancient sites, whether there was giant discoveries, bones and other such things found there or not. We have effigies of giants made of stone. This one here from Chew Magna Church, which is over 7 foot or 7 foot 4 inches tall. We have similar ones in Hampshire as well. Dunster Castle, they found a chained up in the dungeon 7-foot skeleton when it was being excavated. This is not too far from Exmoor and the kind of Somerset coast. And the list goes on. Here's actually the series of giants we've got in this general area. We have the whole story of Gorm the giant up near Bristol, obviously the Cerne giant. We have numerous giants found in Portland, which we're going to be looking at more closely at the Megalithomania conference with Gary Bilcliffe. We have other ones up here, the ones we've talked about already here. Glastonbury Abbey we're going to come to in a moment. But there's a lot going on in this particular area. But if you want to get super close, this is one of the most intriguing stories I've actually come across in the whole world of giantology. This is a story of the Arthur myth of him being discovered in 1191 inside the Abbey. Now, this is one of the most fascinating stories, and this was witnessed by so many people at the time. And there's this whole kind of story that there was this kind of, people were having these visions about these two pyramids under the ground in what was called St Dunstan's at the time. And, eventually, the monks heard about this. This was all linked with the royal family at the time. We do a full account of this in the book. I'm not going to go into every little detail here. Eventually, they got inspired to actually start digging there. And when they dug down, in this particular spot, which was recorded by the royal family of all things, they found these two pyramids, these two kind of almost like obelisks, if you like, in the ground, all these inscriptions on them. And this is where they found this lead cross, which you can see an image of it here, which had inscribed on it, "Here lies the burial of King Arthur and Guinevere," and so other such things. Now, there's different stories of this. There's two different versions, two different historians writing about this. I had a good discussion with Yuri Leach about this some time ago, and he talked about it in depth in one of his excellent books. He let me use an image, which is in the next couple of slides. As they dug further down, according to one of the stories, they came across this giant log coffin, this oak coffin, where they found the remains of this over 9-foot tall skeleton. And in fact, the eye sockets were so large, there are two accounts of this, that one person was able to put their fist through the eye socket, another person was able to put their fist in between the eyes, and the eyes still wouldn't be touching either side of the fist. To give an example of what we're dealing with here. The estimates put it at 9 feet tall. In one account, they talk about finding a second burial with a lock of blonde hair and a second skeleton of a female, which they believe was Guinevere, because obviously the giant was King Arthur, according to them. This was an actual discovery. No, this was a genuine discovery. They claimed it was King Arthur, and some people believe the lead cross was placed there as a hoax to create this story linked with kind of Arthurian stories which were prevalent at the time. This wasn't long after the history of the kings of Britain had been written down and published by Geoffrey of Monmouth. It's like 50 years after. So, and also the abbey was going through it had been kind of destroyed in a fire, and it was looking for kind of money from pilgrims, tourists, whatever you want to call them. And so they created this story, and they were delighted when they found this giant, because it kind of made them, the place to go and visit, and they got all this funding and they rebuilt everything. And this is the spot. You can actually go into the abbey yourself and see this. This sign here, this is the actual spot where they found the giant. and they found so-called Guinevere. They don't mention he was 9 foot tall here. But then about 100 years later, after it had been witnessed by lots of very famous people at the time, we go into the whole list of them in the book, they then moved the burial into the kind of Holy of Holies in the main kind of central part of the abbey. This giant black marble sarcophagus and everything else. And it was seen again, 100 years later, it was seen again, this big pomp and ceremony. The royal family, some of them were there to witness this, and it was placed back in the ground. I don't know if it was a couple of years ago, someone tried to break into this particular tomb, steal the giant. Did you hear about that too? Was it you? There was a thing, you must remember that from, I think it was 2 years ago. I think it was just the start of the whole COVID stuff. Someone went in there, started digging this particular spot. So whether they found any bones or not, we don't know. No, they probably buried it very deep. So technically, so-called, the 9 foot skeleton might still be there. So let's see if anyone digs any deeper.
Maybe 7 or 8 foot. Have you seen it?
Maybe that's it then.
In the abbey.
Maybe that's it then.
Yeah,
but they said it. I mean, according to they said it was a black marble sarcophagus. That's all. That's.
The lids is definitely black marble. They're in the church, but the stone might not have been black marble.
I wonder where the bones were. There's always the big question. This is the kind of this is a brilliant piece of art that Yuri Leach did. Which kind of gives you the two different versions of it. So you have the Gerard of Wales story, which is the one I've kind of talked about. We also have the Margam Chronicle as well, which came out a little bit later, where they claimed there were 3 burials. One of them was, I think, Arthur's brother, one was Guinevere, and one was Arthur himself, which was much larger in stature. Whereas this is the version of the one burial. But this is really interesting because this very similar type of burial to what we're going to see near Stonehenge as well, where a 14-foot 10-inch skeleton was unearthed in the early 1500s. These are some of the famous people who witnessed it in this passage here. Nearby, there are other accounts. I mean, I actually believe that what they found was an ancient prehistoric burial. And if stories are correct about the Kanjik giants, probably one of their rulers actually was buried here originally, and it was known as a sacred area long before Christians got involved. But there are other kind of interesting things found very close to here. This is one of the yew tree bows that was reconstructed by a gentleman here called Cyril Lilly. And these were found, these date to at least 3,500 BC. Several of these were found, these beautiful, gigantic 7-foot tall bow and arrow type things. At least the Iron Age, possibly the Bronze Age. They also found here these carved out oak boats as well, which are very similar to the burial we see in the Abbey. So that was an oak kind of trunk carved out, the one in the Abbey. So they found many boats like that associated here. And this was found not too far from Godney in one of the lake villages. And you can see the beautiful designs on it and everything here. And people are questioning, well, no one could have wielded that. There's no way he could actually pull that. That would have been way too big. But then they found that it was, when they kind of reconstructed it, they found it was better quality and a better hunting tool than those from medieval times. And so it was actually being used. But for anyone to use it, you have to be 8 feet tall or extremely strong, to even use it. And it's known that this was a very much a game-filled area where you would go hunting because of all the lakes and everything else. Here's just, this is actually like from the back of our chapter. This is just some of the accounts that we've come across anyway of the whole Wessex area, like Hampshire, Dorset, Somerset and so forth. I want to give you a little bit of a story about Stonehenge because it's kind of my territory now. But this whole area, further kind of slightly east from where we were just looking, there's a huge amount of discoveries, huge amount of legends here, but let's just focus on Stonehenge here because 1719, in a mound actually called the Giant's Grave in Salisbury itself, which is only a few miles from Stonehenge, it's part of the greater landscape. It's a very wide, large landscape. Well, you get around Avebury as well. They found a 9-foot 4-inch skeleton inside this mound. This was reported several times, not just from one account. This is one of the newspaper accounts. And the fact that it was actually in tradition, the mound was called the Giant's Grave, and it was one of the outer satellite mounds of Stonehenge. Earlier than this, we have the story of Thomas Eliot. This is the 14-foot 10-inch skeleton. Now, Thomas Eliot and his father dug this up at a place called Ivy Church Priory. There's nothing left of it apart from a few blocks. They built a whole housing area over it. It's just south of Salisbury. Thomas Eliot, if you don't know, he wrote the first Latin dictionary. He was an MP for Cambridge. He was a renowned scholar, philanthropist at the time. So was his father. Not just he didn't just witness this as well. This was also witnessed by John Leland, William Camden, famous people at the time. This was around 1508. We worked this out. We did all the analysis of this and worked out this was 1508 when this must have been discovered. And as they were digging into the ground, they found a few different things with the burial. Not only a skeleton, which was 14 foot 10 inches tall. Just imagine that. I mean, that's ridiculously tall. That's as tall as this room. They also found this strange book, which was placed at his feet inside this log coffin. And they found next to it a metal disc. They called it a metal table. It was that big. Circular metal table made of lead and tin. Both the book and the metal table had these strange writing on it, which they couldn't decipher. It could be Canaanite, it could be something odd, but even all these scholars couldn't work out what it was, because it could have been Sumerian, it could have been something really strange that hadn't yet been discovered at the time. This is actually an image of Thomas Eliot with the book, and the disc, and the skeleton, and so forth being discovered. What's interesting about Salisbury and its relation to giants, we're not just talking about Stonehenge here. If we go back even before this to 1474, since that year, every year since then, up until 7-8 years ago, we're talking 600-700 years, a giant has been paraded around Salisbury just after the summer solstice every year, St. John the Baptist Day. What? Okay. Yeah, you have. Yeah, definitely. Well, sorry, that's just a business thing. How long am I on for? Till 5 o'clock, yeah? Oh, okay. I thought it was a 1.5 hour talk. Okay, I'll have to rush through it then. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, I thought it said 90 minutes in the program. So, okay. So this is the Salisbury Giant, and this is actually on display in the museum currently. This is one of the earlier depictions of him. He was being paraded around Salisbury since 1474, and this was actually created by this secret society. They knew something basically. Eventually, he became known as Saint Christopher. And I wondered, well, you parading this giant around for several hundred years. And the royal family come to these parades, these pageants, which now have been happening all over the different parts of the country, by the way, and not just here. He became known as Saint Christopher. I thought, well, hang on a sec, Saint Christopher, he's a saint in the Bible. What's he got to do with giants? Well, in fact, Saint Christopher was a Canaanite warrior giant who was, some accounts put him as 18 feet tall. And he was actually renowned carrying Jesus when he was a baby on his shoulder across a river. What do you know about St. Christopher? He's the patron saint of travelers. Surfers and skiers and explorers have a little kind of card or a little effigy of him on him as for good luck. And there's different stories about who he really was. But why are they calling a Canaanite giant? Why were they linking a Canaanite giant with Salisbury? And this made me really think that perhaps this is linked with the kanji, this is linked with the name given, because even in these early books we spoke about earlier, they were talking about the connection with the Canaanites. And so this was even before the 14-foot 10-inch skeleton was discovered. It'd been now obviously a long time before that. But all during this late 1400s, early 1500s periods, all this stuff was happening. It was happening in North America at the time. This is when all the Spanish, European explorers were arriving in North America, witnessing live giants, battling with them, like the story of Tuscaloosa and so forth. They were going down to Patagonia, the southern tip of South America, and into Antarctica. They were witnessing the Patagonian giants. Some of these were 10 feet tall, having battles with them. Two of the giants there were even kidnapped. They tried to bring them back to Europe, but they died on the way back. This is all in our previous book. So the stories around this time, there was like a wave of giantology kicking off in the early 1500s. So this kind of all fits in with what was going on at the time. But the same thing on Lundy Island as well, which is just off the coast of kind of Somerset, if you like, out in the Bristol Channel. This was a kind of legendary island where giants were said to reside, but it's also recorded by the Romans as a specially holy race of men who refused trade and had visions of the future resided there. Probably the Druids or their predecessors. There, this is actually me when I had normal hair, with Robin Heath and my good friend Stuart Mason, and he was with me a couple of nights ago. Yeah, we were there in 2008 where we actually discovered a stone circle that had been buried under the peat for a long time. And they actually, but there on the island at a place called Paradise, they found two 8.5 foot skeletons with stone-lined burials over it. And the interesting thing about this, why this is important and relates to here, Stonehenge and other places, is because it's on this alignment between Stonehenge, Lundy Island. You actually have Glastonbury here, and you have this what's called the Lunation Triangle discovery made by Robin Heath. This is the stone circle we discovered, which has been completely ignored by archaeologists. I hasten to add. Okay, so I'm not sure what to do here. Let me. I've got like another 80 slides here. Let me just let me have a look. Let's jump to some other bits and bobs. So yeah, so we do find the giants all over Britain. I mean, we're not just talking about the area here. This might just get you interested. Some of you might know some of these areas here. Below Stone Circle, there's a giant found just down the road from there. And actually, the Saxon name of that actually means built by giants. We have even a Freemasons Hall they found skeletons in as well. We have the Repton Giant. This is the one that featured on the BBC programme Vikings Unearthed, a 9-foot skeleton. And probably one of the most interesting ones is this. This is the St Bees Giant from Cumbria, an illustration by my brother Emmanuel. And this is legendary in the world of giantology because some remarkable weaponry and armour was found on his person. And an interesting thing happened when they were digging the grave. Soon after they started digging, great storms and an earthquake. Now, this is something as well. This is the whole chapter in the new book, newish book, called Sowers of Thunder, which was originally a book by Anthony Roberts, a Glastonbury Glastafarian from the 90s. And he and I, and since then we've developed this, we found lots of accounts of people trying to dig giants' graves. Where great storms have broken out. People have had extremely bad luck as though a spell was placed over them. So I find this side of things particularly interesting here. So we'll just do a quick summary of a couple of others and the links with, as I mentioned earlier, very early site that's now being discovered in southeast Turkey. This one here is particularly interesting from Ireland. We've got loads of accounts here, obviously. We have St Patrick. He was really the first, not only the first giantologist, possibly the first archaeologist, because this was written about by Glyn Daniel at Cambridge University. When he was doing his thing in Ireland, trying to banish all the snakes, all the pagans from Ireland, he actually discovered a 12-foot giant when he was digging up one of the long barrows in Northern Ireland. And the weird thing is, this is a genuine thing, and he had to disperse the bones and get rid of them before the local pagans and druids got hold of him. And he actually wrote about this, and he said he saved the soul of this long dead giant by bringing him back to life, and his sort of spirit rose up. He released him from his bondage into Christian paradise, heaven, or whatever you want to call it. And so this was like, and he actually wrote this down in his diaries. This is an actual St. Patrick thing. Not many people realise he was the first archaeologist and the first giantologist. One of the other things about Ireland as well, Northern Ireland, Ulster once called it, this is an area where you get a lot, no one knows why, of something called the AIP gene. Now, this is the gene which triggers gigantism and acromegaly. But it does it in different ways, where it actually, if you kind of pick up this gene and have it in your lineage, You don't have all the problems Robert Wadlow had, where he died young, struggled with pain and things like this. And these are all the giants that lived around at this time. Now, we go through many of these in the book. We've got the Queen there again. And this is the area here where they discovered this. And they realized this may be connected with North America, possibly even the Denisovans as well. Go into it in the book. I can't talk too much about it here. But we have more people 7 to 9 feet tall in this part of the world, in this part of Britain, than we do in any other area of Europe. So that no one knows why, and it's still happening. Families who stay there, who breed in the area, still have this giant gene coming out of this area. Now, I want to throw in one quick one here. This is the famous Irish giant, from not too far from there, which was said to be 12 foot 2 inches tall. It was on exhibit. It was found in the peat bog, and they had to cover him up. This was added later because all the Victorian women who saw what was underneath would faint. He has 6 fingers on some of his hands and feet, but this ended up proved it was a hoax, unfortunately, and we found a whole bunch of other hoaxes when we did our research on this. But there were many other accounts worth considering in this area. So I want to I'll finish up with a little bit on Wales, because that is one of the most interesting areas, and it links very closely with the stories we're going to look at when we get over to the Bible lands briefly. This is Cedi Idris. This is a famous mountain in Wales. Many of you probably know it. It's in Snowdonia region, heading out towards the coast. Idris himself, Cedi Idris really means the giant's seat or the giant's throne. Idris himself is actually a giant. He's known as one of the 3 holy astronomers of ancient Britain, Gwyn ap Nudd being one of the others. Here's him on his seat. This is an image by Dan Lish, he did for our book. But at the base of this, even though we have all these stories about this giant ruling from this part of the world, he could see into the future, the past. He could see all things from his domain. I've climbed up here. I've had strange experiences up on this mountain. Thunder rolling around the kind of rim of the mountain. It's a very, very odd place. But on this farm here, at the base of Cedi Idris, 2 giant skeletons were also found, linking again with the legends. This is Lyn Cow. This is the sacred pool where a water dragon said to have been slain by King Arthur. This is the seat itself where Idris would sit and rule his domain. This is actually the account itself. The 1600s of these 2 7-foot skeletons being found. Interestingly, they were found buried with hazel rods, which are traditional dowsing tools, which is something of high interest. And we do an entire chapter in the book called Giant Geomancers, where we go into the fact that many of the stories associated with these giants in Britain, they were geomancers. They were lining up sites dead straight. I mean, Idris himself throws stones in dead straight lines across the landscape, throw them in triangles, and be placed in specific spots. And you actually look at the measurements and the geometry of them, all lined up perfectly. So these were the legendary giants, had geomantic and geodetic information encoded in the myths. Something JJ and I have been working on is this giantess stories of the giantess's apronful, like we find up in by Claudia de Gowers up in Anglesey, in Ireland as well, all over Britain and other places, where the giantess would stride across the landscape, dropping stones from an apron where the strings would break in specific spots, dead straight lines, ley lines. So we have all these things. But Idris as well, the giant Idris, if you go back into the traditions of the very early biblical traditions, even versions of the Book of Enoch, also very early Islamic tradition, Idris is also Enoch. He's also Hermes. So Idris is actually a mound, a 10,000-year-old mound, very close to Göbekli Tepe, called Idris's mound, basically. And this is right near here, right near Haran. This is actually Karahan Tepe, that site being discovered. And in the Book of Enoch itself, it talks about coming over to Britain. Idris may have been Enoch. Enoch may have come over to Britain. If you actually read the Book of Enoch, you can see these traditions of him arriving here, building sites, astronomical alignments, flying with the watchers or the angels over to this part of the world. Robin Heath's done analysis on this. I've had other people have looked at this, And we're realizing that the biblical traditions have somehow ended up in a mountain in Wales. Very, very odd the more you look into this. And yeah, there's a couple of other bits here as well. Yeah, we actually did some, if you actually read a passage in the book of Enoch, which was part of the old biblical stories, it talks about flying up to different latitudes and measuring in between portals or gaps between stones and measuring the times of the day and the year when the sun would rise and set. Robin Heath found that this exactly matches a very specific spot in Stonehenge. So they were talking about a time and a place in Britain. Stonehenge is linked with many of these giants we've been talking about. So yeah, I'm trying to rush through this now a little bit. But what we're finding is that you start looking into the Book of Enoch, you realize that it's talking about an area, probably in southeast Turkey, where all this originally came from. This area is really, the site you probably know about it. It's Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, more recently discovered, which go back to 11,600 years ago. Is JJ in one of the reconstructions of one of the 20 stone circles that are thought to exist at Göbekli Tepe. You can see the size and the beautiful carving that we're dealing with here. People have no idea what is going on here, who could have built this. If you look into these old stories of the Watchers or the angels and Enoch, it kind of matches everything because they're talking about geometry, they're talking about astronomy. All these sites are beautifully geometrically designed, exactly like the stone circles we find in ancient Britain as well. Finding the same geometries in Britain, which are linked with these giants, as we do 12,000 years ago nearly, southeast Turkey. This is the most intriguing one here. And just to give you a sense of scale of the whole site, these are the areas that have not been excavated at Göbekli Tepe yet. This is the area that has been excavated. These are some of the geometries we're dealing with here, which were analysed and recorded by Alexander Thom at many of these stone circles in Britain. The fact that they virtually match these is remarkable, and it suggests the Book of Enoch might have been right, that they were going out from this specific location, measuring, working with these very advanced beings called the Watchers, or the Anunnaki and Sumerian tradition, building these sites. So we have found direct connections between these two great ancient cultures, and the timeline is starting to fit now. A lot of people are realizing many of these sites, many of these stories are much, much older, and there's not so much of a gap between Göbekli Tepe, which is basically 6,000 or 7,000 years older than Stonehenge. They're finding these post holes of Stonehenge go back to 10,000 years ago. So there's lots of very strange things coming out of the ground. I think one of the most interesting discoveries, which I'll finish up on, I guess, is a site next to, very close to Göbekli Tepe, called Karahan Tepe, originally called Keçli Tepe, which means woman or maiden or goddess or priestess. And this is not too far from Göbekli Tepe, about 23 miles away. And this has only just been excavated, although we've been visiting it for many years before it was excavated. This is the geometry that's come out of the ground, which is exactly the same as other British stone circles. And when we went there on the winter solstice, very serendipitously, it was amazing. We just ended up there. JJ kind of made me go there. We discovered this winter solstice alignment going through this whole stone here and illuminating this stone head that had only just been excavated. And winter solstice morning, the light moves around the head. And 11,000 years ago, it would have illuminated it even better, we realised when we did some research on this. So the other thing we're finding with these stone circles, these megalithic sites in southeast Turkey, is that they're not just using the same geometry, they've not got the same type of astronomy encoded within the sites, like we have the summer solstice at Stonehenge. We have Newgrange, that is a winter solstice thing, very similar to this in some ways. Also, the same measurement systems as well are being used. We've been decoding a lot of this. This is all going to come out in a future book, which is coming out in October. I'm not going to give too much information about that just yet. It's a reconstruction. And this just shows you some of the other winter solstice sites here. Now, Newgrange, in tradition, this was where the Tuatha Dé Danann said to not just have built it, but they were said to have gone back into it and gone back into the underworld. These were often thought of as giant, like fairy giants, if you like. La Cruz, which is an equinox site. We have Chaco Canyon, Menadra in Malta, which we've just been to. Even Stonehenge actually has a direct winter solstice sunrise alignment, which is a bit more obscure, but it is there. And obviously Karahan Tepe itself. And this is a remarkable site, and I highly recommend people go there if you can. We go back there all the time now. It's remarkable. And there are direct connections between the DNA, between this part of the world and ancient Britain as well, which we've found. So yeah, there's a lot to consider when you're looking at giant stories of Britain, because even if you go, even if you look in stories of places like Callanish, or you look further into the stories of Newgrange, you do find very similar things going on with shining ones. There's a story in the Book of Enoch, in fact, where it talks about visiting a place which is almost an exact description of the winter solstice occurring at Newgrange. Where they talk about flames of light occurring in this darkened chamber while the snow and the wind is happening outside. And all these priestly elites kind of going into it and observing this thing for a certain amount of time. And it had tessellated walls of crystal like you find at Newgrange, written about in the Book of Enoch. And it's only recently that people have realized that actually this could be a genuine story of these watchers or these Anunnaki, whoever they are, visiting this part of the world. So the links just keep emerging the more you look into it. So anyway, I'll just finish off on this one slide. This is hilarious because I'm the giant hunter. I'm the giantologist, always trying to find giants. And I go to one summer solstice at Stonehenge. JJ meets a giant, and she couldn't find me to get a photo with the giant, and I vanished for about an hour while the giant was in Stonehenge, and I never got to meet him. But at least JJ got a photo with him, so good job you were there. Anyway, thanks everyone. Thanks for listening.
You have to be out by 5 because they're doing drumming here at 6, so we need to pack away and stuff. Just a couple of questions, anybody? Yep.
You mentioned in the beginning about one of the earliest known names of England being Merlin's precinct. Yes, I've not heard that before.
Merdin's precinct, yeah. Merdin's the old name. Yeah, no, it's just one of the. I couldn't tell you where it's from unless you. It's in the book. Yeah. Some over there. I can't remember exactly where that's from, but it is a genuine thing. That is, and it's actually there's one. We've got one account of him where Merlin's actually a giant. Only one. No other. There's only one account of him being an actual giant. We're always looking for who gets. Arthur always got called a giant. All the Arthur sites, for instance, they all get turned into. They were originally giant sites. So Arthur's Coit, Arthur's grave. They were originally giants' coits, giants' graves, and things like this. I think Merlin, when you start looking at the name of Merlin, you realise that was one of the earliest names. I think Merdin is something to do with white, means white as well. So some people have linked that with the White Cliffs, things like this. But it is one of the oldest names. I think this was from actually a Geoffrey Ashe wrote about this in one of his mythology books. I think that might have been from there. He picked it up from an old Latin text or something. Yep.
About this deep tomb underneath the abbey, which John Cummins was talking about in his talk about whose bones it is. Well, I've just been reading a book I bought for Roman Army, The Turin Shroud, and it said that Jesus was a very tall man. It doesn't say how large, but a very tall man. And he was implying, was this actually Jesus and Magdalene who were buried there? So was Jesus a giant himself?
Well, I've never heard of that.
No, I haven't either, but it's just.
I want to watch the talk.
A
On the recording.
A sudden idea that came across from what you mentioned.
No, I've never heard of Jesus being a giant. I've heard of him. We actually mentioned him in our book. It gets mentioned because he was able to change the weather. It was like a weather change, according to some stories.
Yeah.
But not a giant himself, so that's kind of intriguing.
No,
I mean,
it's definitely mentioned in this book about the Turin out, he was a very tall man.
It would make sense. He was close to God, wasn't he?
Exactly.
Levitate.
Yeah.
Could have just
And he walked on water.
for the time, though.
Sorry?
It could have just been tall for the time that he was born in, because, you know, people were shorter.
Maybe a platform sandals or something.
Nordic blood.
Yeah, and he walked on water.
Yeah, no, I've never heard of that. And I'm quite interested in things like that, because you get these odd anomalies, like you get the occasional very famous person kind of talked about being a giant. It's even like William Wallace, like Braveheart. If you actually, I think you get a chance to make the giant swords they find with some of these families up in Scotland. He was said to be 7 feet tall, if you actually look at him. Yeah, he was said to be really robust. But sometimes heroes and kind of cult-like figures get later described as giants to kind of emphasize their kind of importance and also their kind of spiritual qualities and things like that. So you never know.
Giants don't be in Glastonbury, Torben.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Torben,
He was
yeah.
about 7 foot tall.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask about, because the theory that the planet was the natural state, perpendicular, and the planet moving around the North Pole, and the energy of the toroidal force field of the planet, if people were living in the north, would that kind of energetically stretch them out? And if they were on the equator, kind of like make them smaller, you know, like
Yes, but there isn't no, funnily enough, I'm kidding, but actually we do
You're
write
right about that.
in our
Giants on record. There's a similar thing where you get the further north latitude you get, colder climates where the Earth is spinning sort of slower, you get generally in historical record going back thousands of years, taller, more robust, stronger people. This is like a Nordic thing. It's like the kind of Great Lakes people of the Americas and Canada, and also the Patagonians, like I mentioned earlier, the southern tip of South America, Antarctica. And there's a genuine theory that's been put out about that. Whereas nearer the equator, it's less and less.
Yeah.
But it's also something to do with height and robustness is also linked with the demise of the megafauna, which happened around 12,000 years ago, which was the time of the so-called Younger Dryas impact event, where there was, the big theory now is that the cataclysm that happened there was a whole load of comets hitting the Earth, especially North America, Canada. Some went into Europe and the Middle East as well. It caused this great devastation, ice age that lasted for like 2,000 years, created black kind of clouds in the sky and dust and everything. It's killed off the megafauna, the giant animals and mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, giant sloths and everything else. But in traditions of the Native Americans, it killed off the giant humans as well. And only a few survived. And those that did survive went on to become the great leaders of the Native American tribes. And they were so renowned for being these survivors, North America this is, they became, everyone would try and breed with them to kind of bring back the old ways, the old genes. This is what we talk about in our previous book, Giants on Record, where we're going through all the, because we got to know quite a few Native American elders through our friend Ross Hamilton, like Vine Deloria Jr. and a couple of others, who kind of had recollections, and he spoke to all these elders before they died, collected all these remarkable stories. Many of them, they said it was a matter of fact that these giants existed. So when all these bones were being discovered, it all made sense. So there's myths that talk about kind of what you mentioned, because they're myths and legends and stories, are articulate and oral memories that are repeated perfectly over multiple generations. They're not just like elaborate stories you do around a campfire. These are like precise. It's like the bardic thing. You have to learn it word for word, syllable for syllable, precisely. If you change it, you're in trouble. You get fired. You know what I mean?
One last question, anybody? Yeah.
Yeah, what do you make of the recent story of a giant being discovered a living giant being discovered in Afghanistan?
Yeah, you're talking about the Kandahar giant. Yeah, I've heard about that. Yeah, that's a crazy story. That I think it was the early 2000s. You mentioned Afghanistan. I think a bunch of American soldiers or maneuvers. Then one or two of them went missing, I think, and one came back freaking out. Something bad happened. So they all went out to try and find what the story was all about, and they found this 12.5 foot tall, I think, red-haired, cannibalistic giant living in a cave. And outside of it was a spike with these soldiers' heads on. They had an all-out battle with him. Eventually, they defeated him. I don't know if some stories say they kept him alive. Other stories say they killed him. But whatever they did, they brought him back to America. He's now either residing or dead's buried somewhere in an American base. And over the years, different whistleblowers have come out who said they were part of that team or know people in that team. So this kind of thing is like, what the hell? Is this for real? But why would they suddenly make up that story if there wasn't something in it? And it wouldn't surprise me. I've got this sort of quiet fascination with the whole Bigfoot thing. There's actually a whole thing about British Bigfoot as well, which I want to start.
Another book.
Yeah. And hundreds of accounts, and it's the same thing. It's like they could be living out in the wild, they avoided detection, they're living underground, things like this.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Hugh.
Thanks, Tom. Cheers, thanks.